Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. Welcome to our monthly conversation on racial healing and reconciliation. We have a special guest this evening, Paige Vaughn from Spring Hill College, Professor of Sociology and Criminology, and she'll be talking about her research. But before we get started, we do have on with us Richard Danford, our president of the Jacksonville Urban League. Did you want to say a few words, Richard, before we get started?
Just good evening. Happy to join you all and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. Also wanted to recognize some of our interns, Jamie Krasnogor, who coordinates, among other things, our interns, and also Jeanette Toledo, one of our interns, Caitlin Rodriguez, Nina Cushman, Rebecca Lopez, Mariana Orozco, and also William Malone, who's been really a driving force for this monthly conversation. William, if you can you say a few words before we get started?
Sorry, coming out. No, I've just been looking forward to hearing this. Did you hear me?
You sort of faded out for a second, but you said you were looking forward to hearing this.
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Vaughn.
Great. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, great. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me. This should work. Do you see my really messy desktop? Hopefully.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. And now do you just see one slide? Okay,
Yes.
good. Thank you. Okay. So first, I, of course, wanted to thank everyone for being here. I know it's a busy time of the year. Today, I'm going to be talking about racial disparities across criminal justice systems, some findings that I've found and that other people have found, and some challenges with the research that we're doing and the findings that we're finding, and then some implications of the research, promising reforms. And I'm going to focus mainly on policing, but here are the goals that I have for the talk. So first, I'm going to give a broad overview of my research interests, just because I think it's important to show you how I study and think about things. And then I'm going to get into the more substantive things. So I'm going to go over my recent research and also just how we might study racial disparities across different but interrelated criminal justice systems and their different dimensions. And then I'll zoom in a little bit on my research in St. Louis, and then future research directions that I think we should take. Okay. So this is just a Venn diagram. It's meant to kind of give you a visual snapshot of my research interests, so that you can kind of see where I am in the discipline. I'm trained as a criminologist. So I got my PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of St. Louis, Missouri. And then I went there right after the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson. And then I was there for a good number of years, for 6 years. So, and then I moved to Mobile, Alabama recently. But my research kind of sits at this intersection of violent crime control policy, sociology of punishment, and race and inequality. I usually am studying the direct effects of race on different criminal justice system outcomes. So whether the police are solving crime, whether prosecutors are prosecuting crimes involving certain victims of certain races or ethnicities, and suspects of certain races and ethnicities and things like that. I also look a lot at the mechanisms underlying criminal justice policy. So what gets passed and what doesn't get passed by legislatures and things like that. And then I also focus on the different effects of policies that people do implement on violent crime. So that's kind of my broad research interest. But one paradox that most of my research is based on is this notion of racial minorities being disproportionately overpunished and underprotected, right? So racial minorities are disproportionately likely to be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned, but at the same time, minority victims seem to be disproportionately neglected at all of these stages too, right? So I argue that this simultaneous over-under policing, sometimes it's called over-under policing paradox, is one of the most important, but it's also the most frequently overlooked pattern in criminal justice. So my research focuses on kind of what is causing this paradox to be. Because I studied in St. Louis, I'm generally going to be focused on, since it's a predominantly Black city, I'm usually focused on racial disparities between white and Black people. But I recognize the importance of studying other races and other ethnicities, and I think that's really important for future research. So what do I mean by overpunishment? Overpunishment can take place in outcomes like arrest, prosecution, incarceration. I always try to use incarceration as the example here because it's the easiest to understand, but the United States has the highest prison population in the world. During the latter half of the 20th century, we criminalized a lot of things and we enhanced punishment for a lot of things that were already criminalized. And we saw the start of this war on drugs, right? And it's continued to today, but we've seen declines in some areas, but we have high rates of punishment in America compared to other places generally, right? And then we do see racial disparities in punishment across outcomes too. So when you're looking at things like arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment, you will see race as a direct, having direct effects on arrest decisions and also indirect effects through things like weapon use and other variables. But you can see here some differences. If you look at anything, right? So stop, question, frisk has really big racial disparities. Another one I can show you is physical and deadly force. And just people's perceptions of things like police brutality and unfair policing. African Americans are particularly likely to view the police with a lack of confidence. So that's overpunishment, right? And criminal justice research usually focuses on that and not the underprotection side. So they're usually focused on incarceration trends and the ways in which such trends have been highly racialized and have ultimately perpetuated disadvantage for certain people and not others. But I'm interested in kind of confronting this as a whole, right? And I think that we also need to be paying attention to who's not getting attention from criminal justice systems. And I think there are three ways in which criminal justice systems might be neglecting minority victims in particular. But generally in America, they're also neglecting victims, right? So the first big way that American criminal justice systems are not protecting folks is by not solving crime, right? So we've seen big declines in clearance. So usually that means when you're arrested for a crime, we've seen rates of clearance go down, right? Crime solving rates are going down since the 60s, which is interesting when you think of technology, advancements in technology, right? And you would expect that to increase clearance. So we see very low arrest rates for things like homicide even, which is concerning. we also seem to be really ineffective in attending to the welfare of crime victims generally, right? So one of the most important things, if you ask the victim what will make them satisfied, seems to be informational justice. So victims who are kept informed about their cases and are provided information about their rights, they seem to have more positive attitudes toward the criminal justice system, and they might be more likely to, for instance, call the police when they're a victim in the future and things like that. And access to material resources also seems really important to victims, right? So getting restitution when they're harmed and things like that seem to be important for victim satisfaction. But the criminal justice system isn't great at actually providing these services, right? So there's really great work being done right now by the Alliance for Safety and Justice. They also just published a book. I forget the name of it, but it's really good. And they did a bunch of interviews with crime victims. They found that only 1 in 4 victims actually reported receiving assistance from the prosecutor's office, 1 in 4 from the police, and then 1 in 10 from the prosecutors, right? And the number one reason for not reporting their crimes was feeling that the police would not do anything to help them if they did report, right? So that's an issue. And then thirdly, crime just remains a constant threat for victims and particularly persons of color. And we've seen increases in violence during recent years. And there is a question of whether the criminal justice system actually has a role to play in causing those increases. So that's just something to keep in mind. Officers are failing to kind of remove people who have offended from communities. That's called incapacitation, when you like remove someone physically from a community when they've done something bad. They might not be deterring crime. That's another like theory that we have in criminology, is that in order to prevent crime, you have to show that you will arrest someone quickly and certainly and severely, right, to prevent future crime. And then the big thing that I study is police legitimacy, right? So this also seems to be pretty important in preventing crime. So when you ask some people in neighborhoods why firearm violence is an issue, why violence is an issue generally, they're going to say, well, there's a shortage of resources. When I call the police, they don't come, and then I view them as illegitimate. And then some of my neighbors are starting to retaliate rather than like calling the police because they won't even come, right? So if you're hearing that, then chances are the confidence in the police is starting to wane, or it's already waned to a point where you have really low police legitimacy. And so we can also just expect racial disparities in all 3 types of underprotection. Criminal justice systems seem to be experiencing caseload increases over the past several decades, but you see that the criminal justice systems disregarding certain offenses that might have a low level of detection or low priority, and disproportionately punishing drug offenses and ones that are more easily solved. So here I studied the racial disparities in clearance for a while, and I'll show you a little bit of research. I want to make sure we have time for questions after, but I found that in St. Louis, for instance, you're more likely to have your crime solved if you live in a predominantly white neighborhood versus a Black neighborhood, right? So there are racial disparities in that sense. And then we do see differences in victim treatment. So Black victims are less likely to get informational justice and material resources, right? So advocacy, information resources, and then young low-income persons of color are remain at like the highest risk for violent crime, right? And I'm going to give you an example of that because I think it's really important. So here's an example of one of the homicide rise that was documented in 2020. We also had one years before that, but in 2020, major American cities saw a 33% increase in homicide, which is really, really big, right? And we started to look at the places in which these homicide rises were occurring. And Rick Rosenfeld was a person that looked in St. Louis at what was going on. He studies crime trends, and he found that in over half of the homicides that took place in that year took place in just 6 of the city's 79 neighborhoods, and 40% of the residents in those neighborhoods lived in poverty. 92% of the residents were Black in those neighborhoods, right? And these neighborhoods' homicide rates are more than doubling in that year, so that's a big deal. So we do see racial disparities in who's being affected by the gun violence. And then you start to say, okay, well, what's going on then? What are some possible explanations for all of this? And we can draw on some hypotheses that came from a little bit earlier, right? So the first violent crime rise that we saw in 2015 followed the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And then you saw a bunch of protests around the nation, right? So people were starting to think, well, maybe there's some sort of Ferguson effect going on, and they came up with 2 ideas. One was depolicing and one was delegitimizing. So depolicing just means that, okay, the police are starting to disengage from the public, right? They're getting scared because there are body cameras now, and the police are like starting to fear repercussions of doing anything that might make them scrutinized now. So that was one idea. The more likely one that gained a lot of traction was something called the delegitimizing hypothesis, right? Or it's also called chronic discontent with the police sometimes. This instead connects violence to civilian behavior rather than police behavior, and says civilians are disengaging from the police, right? Because if you're in a disadvantaged neighborhood and you're a person of color, you're increasingly getting discontented with the police who continue to treat you a certain way that might not be fair, right? And so instead of trying to help the police when there's a crime, you're going to maybe instead resort to retaliatory violence because they won't come when you call them anyway, right? So these are the 2 explanations that have kind of been posed from this police community relations standpoint. And when you think about the 2020 homicide rise that happened, you can also think about George Floyd and all of the other instances of police use of force against armed and unarmed people of color, right? And the COVID and all of the chronic discontent that was going on there too. So there are a lot of parallels that we can draw, and these are the 2 big theories that have been posed, and this one seems to be getting some like positive attention, right? So when you do try to look at the legitimacy hypothesis, you can see, for instance, when you're looking at the Gallup poll, which started in 1993 to track confidence in the police, you can see it waning, and you can see in 2020 for the first time a minority of people in America had confidence in the police, which is a big deal, right? So for the first time in the poll's history, you're seeing actually more people not trust the police than trust the police. And then for the most part, after the George Floyd incident settled, and after like the Michael Brown protest, for the most part, you usually see rebounds, but for certain populations, we're not seeing rebounds in confidence in the police, right? For young people and Black people in particular, you're not seeing the confidence rebound, which is an important point. And then, oops, I went ahead. And then when you just look at racial disparities right here, especially, we've never seen this big of a gap, right? In terms of confidence in the police. So there's a 37 percentage point racial gap. That's the largest found for any of the major US institutions in America, right? So here's the police, the black-white gap in confidence in the police, right? Versus other institutions, which are smaller. So we're seeing these issues, and there might be a connection, we think, right, between a lack of legitimacy and confidence in the police and then crime. So I've been interested in studying that and seeing whether that's the case. My dissertation research, I'm going to talk about for a second. I do want to get to questions. I'll be sure to track the time. I'm just going to go over this pretty quickly. But what I wanted to understand is whether there's this over-under policing paradox that has something to do with violent crime increases, right? And I'm still getting to the violent crime increase. I haven't looked at that yet specifically, but I finally got the data. So it's most likely that criminal justice systems are quick to punish minority defendants, I thought, or minority suspects, while disregarding serious violent victimization of Black victims. So that's what I looked at in my study. And I called that dual disadvantage, right? So two big interests. First was Black suspect disadvantage, right? So you can think of it as Black individuals when you don't want to be punished as a suspect, right? So, and I had data for clearance and screening processes. So whether the police solved the crime and then whether at the prosecutor's screening stage, whether they decide to take that case and like have charge someone with a crime or not. And so I did those two stages at first, but I looked at whether suspects are more harshly punished by following them through that clearance and screening stage, right? Or just punished in general. And then I also was able to look at whether Black victims were actually neglected at those two stages, right? So are Black victims not getting their crime solved? And then if they do get their crime solved and they hit the prosecutor's office, are the prosecutors throwing the cases out, right? So is there some neglect happening there? And these were some issues that I had when I was like initially looking at this stuff, right? So I was looking at all the like research on policing and then prosecution and then incarceration, because I initially thought I could do everything. And I just saw a bunch of different frameworks. So it was really hard to piece everything together. I also saw that people were studying those single stages, which made it really difficult to thoroughly assess what was going on. And then we knew little about like cumulatively what was going on. And then we also see a big oversimplification in this research. So a lot of studies just focus on crimes that have one victim, one offender, one crime type, right? Versus what crime actually looks like. It's really complex, right? So sometimes you'll have single crime types, but other times you'll have a bunch of incidents that happen in space and time. You'll often have a bunch of charges and things like that. So I was interested in looking at the whole picture here. If there are two victims, what's going on? If there are multiple crime types, what is going on? If there are multiple weapons, what's going on? So I thought that was really important. And then I came up with this framework that I thought would be helpful in studying this. So I wanted to know if people, groups, or cases were actually being devalued by the police and prosecutors. So was it that a victim's race was leading to a lower clearance? Was it that a neighborhood's racial composition was leading to lower clearance? Was there something about the case that the police were devaluing, like the motive or like the victim-suspect relationship? And then I also looked at these like solvability factors. So was it actually that the police didn't have the amount of detectives that they needed to solve a crime, or was it because weapons that don't involve physical evidence, like guns, are going to have harder to solve cases than cases that involve knives, for instance, right? And then justice system action. So is there like, are cases that involve witnesses simply more likely to be solved or not? And then I looked at it. So I looked at whether Black victims were more or less likely to have their crimes solved and prosecuted, and then Black suspects, were they more likely to be arrested for a case, and were they more likely to get charged for those cases? Really quickly, St. Louis is where I did this study. And it's important to just point out that they were affected in the late 1900s by deindustrialization, depopulation, heightened segregation, rising crime, like we saw in a lot of places in the Midwest. And that St. Louis just has a really, really high crime rate. Violence in St. Louis, homicides in particular, reached a 20-year high in the year that I used the data for, right? So 2015. Which is going to be an issue. But also, I think it's a really good place to study the police and courts, just because they do have a bunch of police community relations issues, and also they have victim services units. So it's easier to get data on victims. And so here's what I'm going to study. I take St. Louis PD data about a bunch of things, and then US Census data to look at neighborhood characteristics, and then I use Circuit Attorney's Office data to look at all of the court stuff. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty here, but I took every incident that happened at one time in one place, what people were involved, what weapons were involved, the solvability stuff like DNA and witness stuff, and whether the case was cleared or prosecuted. And then I put them into the framework, which I don't have time to explain. And then I did some statistics, and then I got results, right? So the only important thing to look at here is that most crimes are not cleared. You don't have to like read these numbers. You can just maybe listen to me. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, but I'm just going to explain the important parts. So majority of crimes aren't cleared by arrest. Yeah, I'll just do that. And then, so with this one, it's hard because I'm looking at whether the case was refused. So you can see the majority of cases were refused too. So this first one, right? So what I'm going to do initially is I'm going to put only victim race. Can you see my arrow when I'm going like this? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start with victim race, and then I'm going to add all the victim characteristics, and then I'm going to keep adding a bunch of factors, right, to see what was going on. And what I find is that victim race matters a lot. I'm only going to look at victims and clearance just because it's really hard to look at the suspects, because a lot of the times you don't know who is doing what. But I'm going to find that victims who are Black are less likely, under one means less likely to get their crimes clear, but it's not significant until I add a bunch of other things to the models, which means that there's something else going on that's affecting things, right? So likely I had to control for number of charges or something within a complaint, but once I control for all of the noise, I find that Black victims are way less likely to get their crimes solved by the police. And a bunch of other things matter. So here I just put all the things that mattered. So all of these things were related to, right? Crime type, number of charges, if the victim was injured seriously, things like that mattered. And then I looked at Black victims and suspects and whether they're less or more likely to have cases refused by the prosecutor's office. And I did the same thing. I just like put race in there first, and then I added a bunch of factors to the model, and I found Black suspects are significantly less likely to have their cases refused, right? So that's in line with the hypothesis that Black suspects are overly punished compared to white ones. And then when I add all of the other factors, the suspect race becomes non-significant, right? So Black people are not less likely to, or not more likely to have their crimes prosecuted, which was interesting. But Black victims across all models are significantly less likely to have their crimes prosecuted. So I do find evidence for all of the Black victim neglect, but not the Black suspect over punishment, which I thought was interesting, right? So there are racial disparities, but we're still unpacking them. And then really quickly, I will say, I'm gonna skip the data limitations. We can always talk about it, or I can email you slides with notes if you're interested in that stuff. But I do wanna just really quickly say, because I wanna get to questions, that I think the next steps here are looking at victims and what they actually want, right? A lot of times we don't actually ask victims what they want, which is really important. And looking at that access to justice throughout all of the stages, right? What are the police doing when a crime hits or what is a detective doing once they get a crime report? Are they calling the victims who are Black as much as they're calling victims who are white, right? Are they putting as much effort into writing a report as they are for white victims? Things like that I think are really important. So looking at like informal things too, like how much of an officer's writing in a report. And then just what does the public want punishment to look like? What does the public want victim treatment to look like? Policing generally to look like? And we're looking at this. I worked at Yale Law School for a little bit, and we're still working on these interesting like survey results that we got from national surveys. And then also like what happens when you do find out that the victims are being neglected at all of these stages? When a victim doesn't get their crime solved or prosecuted, are they more likely to become victims again later? Are they more likely to offend later because they don't trust the police to solve their crimes, right? And those are the data I just got access to, so I'm going to look at that. But people haven't studied that, and that's where we need to be looking, I think, right? And then really quickly, some promising approaches to mending police-community relations are these two approaches: focused deterrence and procedural justice. So one of them, I'm working on a project right now with Rick Rosenfeld, who does a lot of focused deterrence work, but that's essentially when you have a high-risk offender, so someone that maybe committed a gun violence offense in the past and they get out of prison, you go to their door, you have a police officer go to their door with a social worker or with someone, their probation and parole officer who has a card to social services, and they say, we'll help you if you let us, we'll stop you if you make us, right? We care about you, we don't want you to be the next victim or offender in your community, so let us help you. We'll help you with whatever you want. We'll help you with your GED, we'll help you with your kids' truancy, and that has proven to work in a bunch of cities in the United States. It lowers violence and it makes police legitimacy go up, so that's a really promising approach. And then procedural justice is just when you train police officers to be respectful and give people a voice. And when you treat people well, then they're more likely to believe that the law is legitimate and that the police are legitimate, and they're less likely to commit crime. So those are some promising approaches. I have a ton more that I could say, but I'm going to stop there so that we can talk. Thank you for letting me rant about this. I could talk about this all night if you want. But yeah, if you have any questions, email me at that email, and then we can always like set up a Zoom, or you can email me questions and I can respond directly. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, and I like the clarity of the work. It's very, so much of these statistics, if you don't do the right distribution, they're difficult to understand. And these were for me, they're much easier to understand than others that I've seen. But I think we should just open up for questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, as we usually do, so that we don't inhibit any discussions or questioning.
Great.